Hi, everybody. Welcome to our special year-end Q&A. 2020 has been quite a year. That's probably an underestimation. The pandemic, of course, had ripple effects right across the country, including many political implications. So we have assembled our CBC journalists to take your questions about the top political stories of the year and what it was like to cover them. You can send your questions in on the comments section on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. We'll take questions on any of those platforms. Many of you have sent them to me as well. On Instagram, we'll use those too, so just keep sending them in over the next 45 minutes. That's how long we're going to be here, and we're going to try and take as many of them as possible. I want to offer a warm welcome to CBC reporters who have helped us break down the political news throughout the year so frequently on our show. Over in Toronto, Peter Armstrong. Rafi Boudjikanian joins us in Edmonton. Salima Shifji is here with us in Ottawa. Also in Ottawa, but from a different location, different part of the newsroom, is our Ashley Burke. And joining us from Washington is Katie Simpson. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Vashi. Hi, everybody else.
Nice to see you. Good to have you with us. So we're going to start with what normally would be a less obvious question. In previous years, we've done this, but probably this year not as much. So what's the big story you've covered this year? Salima, I'll start with you.
Ooh, I get to go first. That's great. So story of the year, obviously, I would say the pandemic.
Yep.
Is that the right answer? We started covering it a little bit in February. There were, questions to the health minister when there were the first reports of this very contagious virus out of China. There were a few questions in February, but of course we were kind of all preoccupied with the blockades that were happening at the time there. That was the top story of the day for weeks on end. And then in March, of course, there was that news that Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, the Prime Minister's wife, had COVID-19 and was in isolation. And the Prime Minister started with his first news conference from the cottage, right outside his home. And I remember I was actually in D.C., rushing back from D.C. And watching that news conference. And then those first 2 weeks, I was also in isolation, as the Prime Minister was in isolation, covering that every single day about the beginning of the government's response to COVID-19. Following that, there was the Quarantine Act that was put into place where everybody returning had to go into isolation, of course, for 14 days. So things just snowballed from there, basically a new announcement every day as the government was, trying to get personal protective equipment ready and out to the hospitals. And it was, obviously so frenetic, such a crazy response as every country in the world was trying to navigate this pandemic that everybody was thrown into, this global pandemic, and the rate at which the virus was spreading and getting into hospitals.
Yeah, it's interesting when you said that. I remember the day that Sophie Gregoire Trudeau was died. Like, that's sort of in my mind where everything seemed
started.
Yeah,
and it was Friday the 13th, that first news conference,
right.
that the Prime Minister was outside his steps, and I think it was quite a jolt for the whole country and all of us political reporters too. As it began.
Peter, this is such a health crisis that had such an impact on everyone's health and public health concerns, but a huge economic crisis as well. What has this story been like for you?
Well, it's been interesting to watch it unfold and to reckon with all the things that we just don't know and that we still don't know. I wrote a piece fairly early on in the crisis talking about, the shape of the recovery, that, there'd be a V shape or an L shape or a U shape and all these different things. And at the very bottom, I had this kind of throwaway line about it. And who knows, it may look like the symbol for a British pound. It may even be a K, where you'd have multiple different kinds of recoveries happening at the same time. And man, that proved to be really where we're at. And we're still trying to measure that out. We're still trying to figure out what that means, not just for the immediate now. You've got, 500,000 people who lost their jobs at the peak of the crisis that haven't had that job recover yet. You've got almost 488,000 others who are working, but they're working less than half the amount they were pre-pandemic. So you have, 1 million people in Canada right now really struggling as a result of this. Well, we're trying to figure out what the medium term, let alone the short term, and I don't think we can even imagine yet what the long-term implications of this crisis are going to be on the way we consume, on the way we live, on the way we work and commute and do all these different things that our economy has built itself up around. And so trying to get a bead on not just what has happened, but what is happening, and then trying to read smart people and trends and talk to your neighbors and friends and businesses about what's that going to mean 2 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, let alone 4 or 5 years from now. And I think that's going to be the great policy riddle of our day, of how do we assess what has happened, is happening, and will happen, and how do we turn that into policies to try to address the people that are suffering the most, I think is probably going to be the thing that businesses, governments, central banks, markets are all going to have to reckon with going forward.
Rafi, what about you? I mean, there's a couple things that stand out for me in Alberta. Obviously the pandemic, but there was the double whammy, especially at the outset of the pandemic, that the economy fell due to this external force where it came to oil prices that really almost, just sort of added to the strain on the economy there.
Precisely. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people in Alberta's government who are doing exactly what Peter just described, trying to figure out what the economic recovery will look like. It wasn't too long ago, just in February, that this provincial government presented a budget where they said they would balance the books in Alberta by 2023, just a few years from now. And they predicted that based on looking at the price of oil and pegging it at just below $60. Now, a couple of weeks later, oil prices started plummeting. At one point in April, we hit something like $7 a barrel. It's now bounced back a little bit. It's around 33, but Alberta has effectively given up on setting a date for when the budget will be balanced, and are now projecting a deficit of $21 billion. And this is a conservative government, a fiscally conservative government. Them admitting that they don't know when the budget will be balanced is a pretty big admission to have to make. And it might go a ways to explaining why this province was so reluctant to bring in some of the stricter restrictions we've seen elsewhere. It took several weeks during the second wave for the provincial government here to say, okay, we're going to have to shut down some stuff again. Restaurants and pubs and bars and so on went back to takeout only and to delivery, even though for several weeks before that, public health doctors were en masse signing these letters telling the government, listen, you need to shut the province down again. Things are not going well here. And of course, now we're at the point where Alberta has something like a quarter of all the cases in Canada. I remember in mid-May, at that point, Alberta had shut down during the first wave, when everyone kind of did at around the same time. And when Alberta was about to reopen the economy, Edmonton had something like fewer than 60 cases. Like that's how low transmission had gotten. Well, currently Edmonton has around 9,000 cases, basically half of what Alberta's got. I mean, I basically don't do anything other than come to work and stay home because it's just, it's just that dire.
That's a universal thing that we can all share, universal experience.
Yeah.
Katie, I feel like the pandemic was big and certainly factored in, but you got to cover another massive story this year, obviously the election.
The election, and this election, whether there was, at the start of the year, before the pandemic was something that we were talking about, this election was going to be one of the most intense elections in the United States, in the history of the United States. We know that the base for Donald Trump, as well as his supporters and his critics, are both energized by him. He's the kind of figure that people look at him and have an immediate emotional reaction. And so this election was going to be intense, and then you put on top of that a public health crisis. And then you put on top of that the reckoning on race, racism, and institutional injustices in the United States on top of that as well. Following the death of George Floyd, the protests that have erupted across the country and the demand for change that many have saying has been long overdue. This is a year in American history where there's obviously, when you talk about year-end stories, we always talk about how things are unpredictable, and you take a look at what's taken place. But truly, the changes that we've seen in the United States in terms of the political conversations and following this election, and it's just, It has been a very intense year in the United States. It was always going to be an intense year because of this election and because we knew that Donald Trump is that divisive figure that attracts both of those sort of reactions. The people that love him, the people that don't like him really don't like him. And it's the election was one thing, but then, you bring in that pandemic, you bring in the conversation and the demands for equality and demands to address systemic racism in the United States. It has been a year, and a lot of the things that, even though the election was held in November, the election has been decided, there is still this push from President Donald Trump to try in some ways, change the course of what has happened. And so this story continues. This story is not over.
Okay, Ashley, I want to ask you, and then we'll start getting to viewer questions because we've got some great ones coming in. Ashley, you covered the pandemic extensively as well, but you also covered some really interesting stories on the Hill this year.
Yeah, it's been, there's been so much news this year. It's hard to even, we're just going back through my tweets to look at some of the stories, and there's just been so much. But one of the stories that my colleague Kristen Everest and I covered extensively was for months we investigated claims that the Governor General, Julie Payette, had belittled, berated, and publicly humiliated staff at Rideau Hall and created a toxic work environment, and that her second-in-command, Assunta De Lorenzo, also was alleged of bullying staff too. Following that story that we did, the Privy Council office launched an external independent review. They are still in the process of creating a report for the government to look at. It's in the writing phase right now, and an unprecedented amount of people, a larger amount of people than the government expected, did sign up to participate in that. And there was also another series of stories we did since then about claims that the Governor General has a disdain for RCMP, which has driven up costs for security and overtime, to a $250,000 staircase to meet her privacy needs that was never built, and what the government knew about all of this, that there weren't references asked at some of the past workplaces where there was a similar pattern of behavior, sources claim, and what did the Prime Minister know ahead of time before appointing her?
You're modest, but you broke those stories. You and Kristen broke those stories. And I told you this earlier, about a week ago, I was interviewing a politician, and in the break prior to the interview starting, he said, "Oh God, if we get a message that Ashley Burke called, we just kind of have that feeling in the pit of our stomach." So those are some interesting stories. We got a lot of questions on it, and I do want to get to those viewer questions because there's a lot of interest in the way in which we covered this pandemic and the way in which we followed the information or conveyed it to the public. It was sort of a banner year or a unique year for us doing that in the circumstances that we faced, that so many other people faced in their lives, not being able to go into the office, for example, as much. Let me start with you, Salima. Was it difficult? David Bocage, I apologize if I'm saying this wrong, on YouTube asks, was it difficult for reporters to follow the safety measures given by public health officials?
Oh, that's a really good question, David. Sometimes it was. I mean, we all sort of did it a little bit differently in terms of how we covered the stories. I kind of half worked at home, but you kind of have to come into the office. Often, Vashi, you were in the office, right, hosting specials as well. So we were kind of half in, half out in a way. And yes, we're often following the Prime Minister at Rideau Cottage, for example. At the beginning, there was this confusion over the masks. We were outside, do we wear masks? Do we keep masks on as we're asking a question at the mic? I think things shifted over time as we were starting to cover things as well. And then every reporter will know this too. We sort of had to jimmy mics that are really far, so you're able to do an interview with somebody at a distance that is universal for all of us. But on the Hill, there were some moments for sure when you were kind of following a politician as they were walking down, and it didn't feel like it was that distanced or as much as it should have been. The parliamentary press gallery as well was quick to change things. They started putting up unimics, but that also made covering the politicians harder in a way. And I'm sure Ashley and Vashi can weigh into this as well. There are cabinet meetings now, and usually when we cover a cabinet meeting, we kind of hang out in the hallway and wait for them to walk by and shout questions at them and grab them and bring them to the mic. Not physically grab them, but metaphorically speaking. But you don't do that anymore. Basically, now we get a list of the ministers that will come out.
Whim a bit more.
Exactly. So that has sort of gotten in the way, I would say, in terms of our normal methods of gathering and holding politicians to account. But yeah, I think there was a time when we were sort of all adjusting a little bit and starting to put those measures in place. And now we come into the office and wear our masks all the time, basically.
Gary Franco, Peter asks on Facebook, what was your biggest fear in this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, man, there's so many, right? And I think we've all been on assignments where we've been legitimately scared before, and this one struck a bit of this one had some teeth, you know. Like I was away, I was in Mexico when the pandemic struck. I was there with my family, and coming home in those first early days, like of the pandemic, the WHO had declared it a global pandemic earlier that week, and we were in the Mexico and then Toronto airports on our way home, and it was kind of spooky. So there was that level of sort of visceral fear of like, what's this going to be like? Are my kids okay? Is my wife okay? Before we had left on that, I remember the weekend that we were leaving, I was filing stories to the National about, that Rafi was talking about, that collapse in oil prices. And I remember thinking, this is scary. Like something's wrong in the system that is sparking all of this, and fear is driving things. And when fear starts to drive things in markets, it can get pretty wonky pretty fast. And then, 10 million Canadians were adversely affected in terms of their jobs and their ability to pay their bills through this. And I know some of those people, and I got to know a lot more through this. And it is such a scary thing to have to go through. How am I going to pay the mortgage? How am I going to, make sure my kids are eating? Like we live in such a lucky, prosperous, country that to watch people go through that and to see your neighbors and people that you know and people that you would meet through this go through that was frankly some of the most frightening things that we saw. And then we saw, the other side of that is hope. We saw what impact public policy can have. And these programs that came, these would take years to build if we had tried to come up with a system, and they put them together in days or weeks. And yeah, there were problems with them, and we're dealing with those problems now with the CRA saying people are going to have to pay back, and those are causing some fears. But the overall thing that they were able to get money out the door and to the people that needed it, we're at a record low of insolvencies in the country right now. It has been able to keep roofs over people's heads and food in people's fridges. And it is a remarkable thing, especially when you think back to, late March and early April, and just how kind of terrified we all were.
I think it also sort of changed what people expected of us, right? Because, even on my show, it's a political show. We're normally talking about the politics of everything. It changed during those initial months of the pandemic when people were just really searching for information. What do I need to know about this government policy? Here's where I think the gaps are. And that I found even my questions towards ministers, for example, or people in decision-making roles changed because I was thinking of all those emails we were getting from people who were affected by those policies, and it just changed the nature of the show. It changed the nature of interviews I was doing. It was so unique, I guess. Rafi, what about you? Or sorry, Peter, jump back in.
Well, just one last thing on that is I think in watching your show as a consumer of it more than a correspondent who reports into it sometimes, I watched that happen, and I got that sense that you had my back and that programs like yours had my back, and we watched that have an impact on public policy, that when they came out with the wage supplement and the rent supplement and some of these various programs that clearly were going to fall short, that it was the ability of people at those news conferences every morning and shows like yours that were getting the ministers on to say, well, wait a second, is this enough? And then we saw the policy shift, and we saw the yardstick in which the threshold, the change to make sure that enough people were going to be covered under this umbrella. And it's a remarkable testament to journalism and its power and its importance in not just sort of the big capital letter holding government to account, but in probing in and asking and representing our audiences and saying, well, wait a second, this doesn't match up with what we're hearing on the ground, and then seeing those policies change was actually, the system can work sometimes.
Gary, Rafi, Gary wanted me to ask more than one reporter. So what was your biggest fear in the pandemic?
I think it was just the idea of how do I keep doing this job without becoming sick myself? Because there are stories you can do by staying home or, only sort of teleconferencing with the people you need to interview. But then, you might remember at the end of April, there was that big flood in Fort McMurray. And that's a big national story. You can't cover that from home. You have to get yourself there. So I kind of went from 0 to 100 in terms of, just self-isolating as much as possible, not seeing anyone if I don't have to, et cetera, to just, go to Fort McMurray, interview people who are there physically, of course, taking the physical distancing steps and being as careful as possible, but that was a very different dynamic out there. So just kind of figuring out how to stay safe while still being able to do the job that you need to do as a reporter, I would say that was kind of the biggest fear. And I do find it interesting what you're talking about in terms of people emailing you and, trying to sort of suggest maybe, what to talk to politicians about. On a more micro level, it's really been happening here too. I had never seen anything like this before. I mean, I don't call into the news conferences of Dina Hinshaw, the Chief Medical Officer of Health, every day, but I do call in fairly frequently. And I just start getting bombarded on Twitter, whether it's direct messages or just replies to my live tweet saying, hey, you should ask her about this. And I'm by no means alone. I think every journalist in Alberta who's calling into those things gets that kind of direct feedback from viewers and listeners. And I guess that just speaks to how, A, how much everyone cares about the story, and B, how much everyone's home and able to absorb these things as they're happening, as opposed to kind of catching up to news at the end of a traditional workday.
Yeah, very true. Definite shift in viewing habits because everyone's at home. Katie, I had so many questions sent in to me via Instagram about a lot of what we all watched you cover around protests throughout the year. In particular, on Instagram, Ian Mack 25 asked, how do you feel about putting yourself at personal risk during anti-mask protests? And then Yoon Shabloon 88 on Instagram asked, were you and your crew ever afraid at Trump rallies or events COVID-wise? So how did you feel about covering those, and were you ever worried?
Well, this is my job. I signed up for this. There is risk involved in this job. And so I knew that whether we're in a pandemic, whether we're not in a pandemic, I signed up for this job. I love my job. You have to check that. You have to acknowledge that. You have to check that. Another thing is there's sort of in any sort of crew I've ever worked in, there's always veto power. And this was taught to me very early, sort of in when I worked in my first bureau, when I worked in Ottawa, not at CBC, at another network, where if you go out into a situation where there's the element where something dangerous could happen, if someone in the crew does not feel comfortable, they can veto it. And everyone just has to accept it. You are a team and everyone works together. It's very much about teamwork. And when we go into protests and we go into different things, you'll often hear during live hits, I'll be talking to my camera person on air and say, is it okay? I'll talk to my cameraman, for example. His name was Paul Andre. Paul Andre, we're going to walk across the road here. We're going to go into this, and we're going to do these kinds of things. It's all about safety, making sure everyone is comfortable. But when you do accept a job like this, and you do a job like this, you accept that there is an element of risk. You have to do everything you can to make sure you minimize the risk. We get excellent training at the CBC about preparing for situations, not specifically a pandemic. We have incredible guidelines that we do follow here, and I think I don't want to jinx anything, but I've been in a lot of rallies this year, whether they are anti-mask rallies, whether they are Black Lives Matter rallies. I've been in a lot of rallies and a lot of protests, and we are wearing our masks. We have our 6-foot distancing pole, but at the same time, there are elements of a situation where you just can't control, and you really just have to do your best to follow the best safety practices and do that. There were a couple of moments where I had a moment where I sort of had to check myself. The first big Black Lives Matter protest in Washington happened in May. It was about a week after George Floyd was killed. And it was the first time many people had been out, because remember, lockdown had been in place. Lockdown in DC was still in effect at this time. I believe it was May. And it was the first time people had been out. And the protests at that point, there was pushback from police, and police were firing tear gas into the crowd. And it was becoming very, very intense as the night went on. And it was a Saturday night. And we had to call off our live hits in the middle of a live hit because the crowd was starting to run. And when the crowd surges, you can't do anything to control that. And I think even one of the live hits I did, I said, stop running, which you can't tell people to stop running. Police were pushing in, they were pushing the crowd back. And so when that becomes the case and you can't predict which way the crowd is going to move, you need to get yourself out of that situation. And we're taught that. We're given that training. But I'll remember we called off this live hit in the middle. It was maybe it was getting close to 1 o'clock in the morning. And we'd been surrounded by this group of protesters who were yelling at us. They were yelling at me. and they separated my cameraman and I, and one of the protesters grabbed my microphone. And in a situation like that, I should have just let go, and I didn't. I held on and I pulled it back. But as they sort of, and we were on our way out, we were going home, we're like, okay, this is unsafe. And as I'm pulling my microphone back, which again, I should have just let it go. It's a microphone, we can get another one. But I held on, I pulled back, and I could feel the guy was not wearing a mask, and he was yelling at me, and I could feel the spit. His spit hit my arm, and I thought, COVID, COVID, COVID. So we ran back to the bureau, and I sort of like ran like this with my arms out, not to touch anything. We got into sort of the main area of our office, and there's a hand sanitizer dispenser, and I basically like ran my arms under the hand sanitizer just to get in. And then I got in the elevator with my cameraman. We went up to our office, and we have a sink in here, and I just stood there and just scrubbed my arms, because what else can you do? You can't do anything else. So that was where I had sort of a moment. And when we got our COVID tests back after that protest, it was a relief. And every time we go in to these protests, whether they're at the Trump rallies, at the pro-Trump rallies, and those events, they are largely maskless. Some people are wearing masks. The Black Lives Matter protests that we covered, largely people are wearing masks, and that has been the theme. Except when we got surrounded that one night, that was a Black Lives Matter protest when we got surrounded and the guy was pulling on my microphone. Again, I should have just let it go. But I cannot tell you the sense of relief that you get when you're like, okay, it feels, it's a sigh of relief. But the other thing is, I live at home. I live alone in Washington, and so I can only imagine what it's like for my colleagues who have kids, who have spouses, that they get home and then have to isolate, and just the fear of spreading it. That is my fear. Like when we get home, we stay at home. We can't come into the office. We have to take a test, and we follow our rules. And so far, it's worked. Knock on wood.
Yes, knock on wood, and we're glad that it has. Jack Snow, just a quick comment to you, Katie, on Facebook says, love Katie's use of the boom mic.
It's like a hockey stick.
And just a quick note that you can keep sending in your questions on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter in the comment section, where we are trying to get through as many as possible. I'll attempt to pick up the pace a little bit. Let's turn to some Canadian political questions, Ashley, because we've got a lot of them on not only what happened during the pandemic, but some of the stories around it. First of all, do you think there will be, Doo-Wop54 asks on YouTube, do you think there will be a federal election this year? If so, is spring or fall more likely?
I think everyone's wondering that. I don't think anyone has the stamina at this point to do that, though. I think that's what we've been hearing. You heard Rosie Barton this weekend had an interview with the Prime Minister and asked him that question. He said, obviously, that's something they don't want to go ahead with, but in a minority government, it's not just up to the Liberal government.
He also kind of slipped, though, and said, like, yeah, the election next year, oh, wait, if there is one. So
exactly.
Made me think there probably will be.
We want to know that answer, though, right?
Yeah, we certainly do, definitely. Let's ask another question, Salima, around some of the politics. Wasil Dennis on Instagram asks, where did $250 billion get expended? Now, this is part of the Big Spend project. That was they had identified $240 billion fighting COVID-19 over 8 months. Obviously, the fiscal update offered some different figures, and those figures will continue to be updated. But when we're talking about a big number like that, if you were to identify, and Peter, I'll get you to weigh in on this as well, some of the big areas of government spending that contributed to that.
Well, when you look at it, there was an announcement after announcement, and then Peter alluded to this about how the government was really sort of just trying to get money out the door really quickly in those early days when everybody was so worried and it was a major lockdown, right? So, of course, the CERB is a massive amount of all of that money that went out the door, the wage subsidy as well for a lot of businesses, and there were quite a few questions on that front in terms of, what some companies were doing with this. There's some reporting that we have been doing out of Toronto that, some companies are perhaps posting a surplus with that money. So there's the wage subsidy as well. There were plenty of programs where the government was just trying to support people who, of course, had to stay home, could not go in to work for fear of catching the virus or spreading the virus, and, people trying to work from home, a lot of self-employed people as well. So And it was interesting how Peter was also mentioning that the adjustment in terms of the money going out the door as well. At first, it was perhaps this much, and then the government expanded it to cover more people and a more higher percentage in terms of people on the payroll. So there was a lot of money out the door, and you see those in those numbers when you see the fiscal update as well, in terms and the messaging, from the Liberal government as well, saying, we are still going to be supporting Canadians, and we will kind of deal with that a little bit later in terms of reining in spending. Just kind of the message that we are still not out of this pandemic, and we're still needing to support many Canadians out there.
Peter, what jumps out at you when you talk about the government's fiscal response to all of this? And just quick note, it's direct spending, and then there's also money that was foregone because of deferred taxes, a whole bunch of deferred revenue streams, basically.
Yeah, and there's always two sides of that, right? There's a massive drop in revenues, there's a huge spike in spending, and it's going to take us years, even if we go by, the fairly, I think, optimistic books that we saw in the last fiscal update about when they think they're going to get. They don't even have a plan to get back to a balanced budget, but back to within spitting distance where we were before all of this. It's going to take us years to get there. But the sheer scope of it, Vashi, it's important to sort of stop for a second and sit back and say this government spending, I think it's $950 million a day through this crisis to help people out. It is a staggering sum of money. It is, and I mean, it's interesting to see the arguments around the periphery of the spending. There are some people saying we should have had tighter this, we should have had more specific that, but I don't think there's a lot of really mainstream people saying that was crazy, we shouldn't have done any of that. And it's interesting how in that moment, I think we all saw the importance of social policy and what it can do, what it kind of meant to do. But yeah, we're $240 billion in payments went out the door and did largely, and you really have to zoom out to get to the largely, because people were left behind, mistakes were made, the rollout wasn't perfect by any means, but largely it was able to get the money to the people that needed it and to bridge people through a crisis. And because imagine, we're seeing it in the United States, all of these families that have had to go without, and you have these drive-through food bank lines that are just the most, that's
the visuals are crazy, for miles, lined up for miles.
Exactly. And in the most prosperous country in the history of the world, how on earth is that happening? Well, because there you did have people saying, well, the best stimulus policy is a job. Yeah, sure, but your job doesn't exist anymore if you work at a convention center. And it's important through this to remember what we do, right? The most common job for Canadian men is truck driving. The most common job for Canadian women is retail sales. 2/3 of Canadians make less than $47,000 a year. It is easy, I think, for people in white-collar jobs and white-collar neighborhoods that are more affluent and better off to look at the situation and say, it's not so bad, it's okay. The vast majority of Canadians were put in a really dire position by this, and public policy was able to get them through. We're going to spend years unwinding it. We're going to spend years paying for it and paying it back and figuring out how to make that work. But in that moment, I think you have a sort of A/B testing of what did it look like in the States where they let that stimulus program wind down and have only just reinstituted it last night, versus what we were able to do. And we started winding it down. We moved away from CERB into more EI programs. We've wound down some of those payments. But we've seen what it looks like when you don't do it, what it looks like when you do. And I think that, to me, is the most interesting contrast.
Rafi, we've got a question here from, I have no idea, IPPE94. I don't know how I would say that. What did we miss? This is a question I think about often. What did we miss domestically and internationally? I think it's a relevant question because we've been so focused on the pandemic and certain other huge stories that there is a lot of other stuff that didn't necessarily get as much coverage as a result.
Well, that's a pretty big question. I mean, I suppose it's fair to say there are a lot of the kinds of stories we would be doing in previous years that none of us really did do this year, right? So, in thinking about some of the systemic racism issues that were followed in the United States, Katie was talking about them. I mean, we did kind of pick up on Canadian angles of them, but how deeply did we really go into those stories versus, just kind of say, yeah, this does exist in Canada too, but then kind of name check that and move on. Of course, we did do the stories when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police at one point said, you know, well, is there systemic racism? Maybe there isn't. And of course, then they had to go back on their word and admit that that is the case. But yeah, exactly. Brenda Lucky, Rosemary Barton interviewed her. And then, of course, before she admit that it is the case that systemic racism exists, the Deputy Commissioner in Alberta, Curtis Zablocki, also denied that that's an issue here. And then they all kind of had to go back on their word. This happened sort of in parallel to our investigative colleagues here in Edmonton, Charles Varsnell and Jenny Russell, getting their hands on that famous videotape that showed an Athabasca Chippewa First Nations chief, Alan Adam, getting attacked by RCMP officers one night in Fort McMurray. Then they charged them with assault, and then they ended up dropping that assault charge. I believe you had Chief Adam on your show as well, Vashi. Again, I mean, we kind of touched on that story, but also, you know, it's gone away since the end of June, basically, right? Like, we haven't really tackled those issues on a more sort of, I guess, you know, holistic approach throughout Canada in other institutions as well. And that's something that I think if we weren't preoccupied with the daily back and forth of the pandemic all the time, it's something we would have delved more into.
Yeah, my list is mostly international stuff that we would have covered a lot more of. I think of the farmer protests in India, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I mean, we had some stuff on the show for sure, but not to the level that we maybe normally would have, and also what's going on in Ethiopia.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict just kind of, yeah, I mean, we dipped in and out of it, but you know, it didn't get the kind of coverage you would expect a war at the edge of Europe to get normally in a year that wasn't so preoccupied by a pandemic.
Anybody else have thoughts on that question?
I was going to say, and so much of the coverage was also within the lens of COVID as well, right? We would cover, because everything is about COVID-19 and the pandemic, really. Like, for example, remember when Canada lost its bid to get a temporary UN seat? Remember that? That was in June. But everything about that was basically how Canada shifted its strategy. They were still working on trying to get that temporary seat, but they were using the pandemic. The Liberal government was basically using the pandemic as a way where they can convene people, and, you know, we're a G7 country, and that was sort of how their messaging around that strategy, which has been going on for years, the campaign to get the UN temporary seat, although a much shorter time than both Norway and Ireland, which is perhaps why we lost it. It was kind of seen within the lens of COVID-19. So I think that also has had an effect this whole year on virtually every story. You know, we'll cover stuff. Like, I was in India doing some stories out of India, but of course it was how India is dealing with COVID-19, right? So everything.
Well, we have some questions about when you eventually start working there full time. Will you be covering other stuff there? Do you imagine, for example, we have a lot of questions on the farmers' protest.
Oh, absolutely. The farmers' protest we're actually already working on a story to look at the underlying issues of the farmers' protest, because it is such a big issue, and it has been in the underlying fabric of Indian culture for a long time. It's been a simmering tension in terms of agricultural laws and how Prime Minister Narendra Modi is trying to change them. And of course, that issue affects so many people, not just in India, but in the diaspora community here in Canada. So 100%, that is a big story. There are plenty of other stories in India, you know, religious tensions, for example. There's some, you know, love jihad rules that laws that are being passed or thought of in certain states. There are a lot of stories that we will absolutely be getting to. But of course, COVID, I think for in any bureau, is also going to be super prominent in 2021 as the vaccines are starting to be rolled out, not just in India, but of course in every country. So.
Sort of not COVID related. Matthew Watt on Facebook, Katie asks, what do you think are the biggest lessons learned by Canada from America First, regardless of who inhabits the White House? It's a relevant question because that theme echoes through in a completely different, with a different tone, but there's still concerns around that type of sort of looking inward when it comes to trade.
So I think there was a big shock, at least among some politicians in Canada. Remember when there was that initial PPE crisis, and there were shipments of masks, I believe it was masks, N95s, that were supposed to go to Ontario, and Donald Trump put down an order to try and stop that, to keep everything in the United States. I think that is a lesson learned, that we need to make sure that we, in Canada, do have a domestic supply and domestic production of emergency materials in case of emergency. I think that, given how close the Canada-U.S. relationship is, there are certainly going to be a lot of sort of examinations of which country did things right, and where they can learn from those things. And so definitely learning moments include the international, the global crunch and demand for personal protective equipment, and how Canada could have seen some of those supplies in jeopardy because its closest ally was looking to keep things at home. I remember Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, his shock to that. And this is after, not long after he had said that he would endorse Donald Trump for president. He was personally taken aback that a decision coming from the White House could be so detrimental to your close ally. That's one issue there. I think one thing that Canadians can sort of look at, and I haven't been home in a year. So I watch CBC News, I watch Canadian news, but I haven't been home in a year. So please correct me if I'm getting some nuance wrong here. But the debate in the United States and how masks became political, I know that there are some protests in Canada that exist, that some people are very unhappy, with lockdown rules, unhappy with masking rules. But down here, watching how the debate around masks became a debate, how that even happened, and watching the politicization of a public health issue is something that not just for Canada to watch and learn, but for the world to watch and learn, to see what happened and why, and what were the causes of this, and why this happened. That is something that has been incredible to watch. So things like that, re-examining the relationship, and then looking at some of the deeper issues and the deeper tensions, and examining the why and the how.
You bring up an interesting point around the debate that leads me to this, made me think of this question. Fern on YouTube actually asks, as reporters on a job site, do you find a difference in attitudes towards the virus and each other amongst the reporters? As colleagues occupying the same spaces, do you ever feel unsafe amongst them? This sort of speaks to the debate that's happening elsewhere in society, but do you ever feel it on the job?
I haven't witnessed that in our newsroom at all, of course. And I've even, at the beginning of the pandemic, when it wasn't normal wearing masks, I remember people were getting alerts saying, we saw you in the security not wearing your mask, put it on in the very first day when it became mandatory. And people have been really compliant here. I think when you're out and about, I've gone to some protests for things like Flight 752 on the Hill, and most people were wearing masks there. So I haven't come across that personally myself, but I'm doing a lot of working from home, like Salima mentioned, where we're doing most interviews just over Skype or FaceTime. So I haven't come across those kind of troubles yet. I have had people, when I'm doing stand-ups, come up to me in the back room that aren't wearing masks and say things sometimes, but that's just about the extent of it.
Okay, we're going to try and end this, goodness forbid, on a positive note with a question I think I'll get all of you to answer if you don't mind. Justin Richard on Facebook asks, what story most inspired you or gave you hope this year? Peter, what about you?
So, in fact, I've just finished writing a story that's going to run, I think, at the end of this or maybe early next week, about a series of businesses across the country that pivoted during the crisis, that in that moment of disaster, when it all came apart, and I talked to one guy who said, I woke up and I realized what was happening, and I first thought of my friends and my family, and then my third thought was, oh man, my business is done. He imported clothing from China and made high-end, sort of hoodies and stuff here in Canada, and he pivoted. And now he's making masks, he's making surgical gowns for Ontario hospitals, he's supplying PPE to the TTC. He changed his whole business, and he took that crisis and completely changed what he did. He didn't have any expertise in this world, but he tried to find a way. We talked to, some of those auto parts manufacturers that Flavio Volpe was involved with, that took plastics lines and made, the plastic swabs you put up your nose for the testing, and plastic parts for ventilators. And to me, it just shows how incredibly flexible and how incredibly creative the entrepreneurs of Canada really are, and how when that moment of crisis hit, a lot of them put their businesses, said, we're going to try to figure out how to make this work. I don't know if it'll make any money. I don't know if it'll work at all, but we're going to give it a shot. And to me, it was such a great story of creativity and of flexibility and of willingness to help. that in that darkest moment of the crisis, these people tried to find ways of giving back and of getting things done.
Salima, what about you?
I got to say, I really loved seeing, and it was over and over again, different province, different vaccine, different country, but I loved seeing people get vaccinated for the first time. And honestly, when you think about what went into all that science that went into getting all of these vaccines ready in record timing, it is phenomenal. And just watching some of those visuals, honestly, what stands out was that older man in Britain who was on live television basically saying, I don't plan on getting this bloody virus. You know, honestly, I thought that was really inspiring just to think about all the science and how so many countries and scientists work together to get that done in record timing. And, you know, just in terms of vaccines in general, speaking of when I was in India, I was covering, you know, how they are mass producing so many of these vaccines and going to be selling them at a cheap price to poorer countries. So I think that is inspiring in this pandemic, how countries, how companies all around the world have sort of worked on this together, the science and the production and all of that. That's pretty inspiring to think about.
Rafi, what about you? What inspires you?
I think I'm having a hard time focusing on a single story, but I will say, especially over the last few weeks, we've interviewed a lot of emergency workers, healthcare workers, physicians, nurses, and it's really inspiring to just hear the extent to which they will go to help and protect their patients and the families of those patients as much as they can. I mean, I've heard stories from a physician just a couple of weeks ago who works in palliative care, and she was telling me how difficult it is right now. Obviously, you know, especially in palliative care, I mean, you're not saving every patient right now, right? But she was talking about how it brings her hope just to be able to be there for a patient in their last moments, and in some cases to be sort of the link between that patient and their family, because as you know, right now, you know, frequently families can't see their loved ones die just because of COVID. And so physicians and nurses find themselves in these situations where they're the last link. Like, they will call up the family member, they will set up a Skype talk. And she was talking to me about how often she has been doing this. And even though it's certainly very bleak and morbid, it just, you know, gives her, I guess, inspiration to be able to be there in those last moments.
Ashley, what about you?
I think for me, it was a lot of the local news stories about people helping each other out. I mean, I'm just picturing what I saw out my window every day throughout the pandemic was a couple streets down from me that people would line up every day for the last 9 months at the end of their driveways and work out together on one street near me. And some person would be yoga. They had their kids out there. They were all socially distanced. Some days they, you know, each person led a different exercise every day, and they kept it up every day throughout the whole pandemic. It's just those little things like that, I think, that have really brought communities together. And I think we're all going to remember that and hopefully carry some of that forward.
Gosh, I hope so. Katie, what about you?
Nurses, doctors, paramedics, people who work in hospitals, people who work in doctor's office, custodian staff, everyone who puts their lives on the line to try and keep people safe as we just try to survive.
And there's so many of them who have done it and continue to do that as we ride this second wave through. Guys, I'll leave it there. I want to thank all of you for not only your contributions during this entire time to our show, and to NN in general, but also just for making the time today for this. I appreciate that, and I wish you all the happiest of holidays. Thanks to Salima Shivji, Peter Armstrong, Rafi Boudjikanian, Ashley Burke, and Katie Simpson.